Welcome to Chess with Link, folks. Today we're going to be talking about an opening that you can pretty well play at most levels of chess. It's called the Very Quiet Game. Let's go. We're going to begin by bringing our pawn to e4. A nice solid opening. So solid, in fact, that black will often mirror the opening. If they don't worry, these first three moves generally work great against most responses. Our next move is to bring our knight to f3. This takes the king's knight off of its dark square at g1 up to the light square at f3 and threatens the dark square at e5, where our opponent just moved their pawn. Note how your knight alternates colors. That's going to be important, especially later in a game. Now, putting our knight on f3 does limit our queen's options. We cannot now bring our queen out for, say, a scholar's mate, but we're not going to worry about that because that's a flashy opening. It's something that you do to show off to friends, but it's not a very principled opening. Black knows that, and they're going to probably bring a knight to c6. Now, moving the queen's knight from b8 to c6 lets you guard the e5 pawn. Again, noting how a knight moved from a dark square to a light square to guard a dark square. From here, we're going to have white bring a bishop to c4. Another move that may feel familiar to some of you who have played low-level chess and enjoyed running a scholar's mate or a wayward queen attack. At this point, you're likely to see black mirror this move. This is because both sides now have bishop attacks on the king's weak spot of f7 for black and f2 for white. Remember, a lot of chess is about planning for later, setting up places where your pieces are going to help each other in future moves, not going for the quick and immediate flashy move. Which is part of why one of the next steps of the very quiet game is to push the pawn to c3. This is all about planning for the future. Sure, it lets our queen potentially move out to the a file. Sure, it blocks in our knight, but it also guards d4, which is a place that our f3 knight could go in the future and where our d2 pawn could possibly attack. Note, yes, a lot of if-then statements happening here. That is chess. Trying to take the possibility trees of all of these moves that might happen and narrow them down to a narrative that you feel comfortable with and your opponent doesn't. And that's part of why black often will respond with the g8 knight coming down to f6. This allows black to potentially castle in the future. It puts pressure on our initial pawn right there at e4, and it puts pressure on several squares that black may want to use in the future, but which are currently contested or inaccessible. That's part of why we're going to now push our pawn to d3. And at this point, I understand if you're maybe starting to be a little bit overwhelmed by all of these piece names and square numbers. Don't worry about that too much. What we're looking at here is trying to build staggered zigzag or diagonal formations of pawns, where our pawns are protecting the pawn that is forward and to one side. And we're trying to make sure that we have opportunities for the future that don't trap our pieces too much. After all, we have just trapped our c4 bishop from being able to retreat, so we will have to keep an eye on that. Black will often move a pawn to d6 as well now. Why? Well, in addition to having an even stronger pawn chain and support for their bishop, just like we have support for our bishop and a little bit of pawn defense, it also allows Black to bring the bishop down to g4, supported by that f6 knight, and pin our knight to our queen. Keeping an eye on g4 and seeing if you can get that bishop to come out with a strong diagonal and then zip back along the other side of this triangle to get the queen is a powerful way for Black to gain tempo. And let's note that we have the same opportunity playing as white to move to g5 with our bishop and pin the f6 knight to the queen. Remember that when I say a pin, I'm kind of conflating the ideas of an absolute pin and a relative pin. It's legal for Black to move this knight, just as it's legal for white to move the f3 knight. But it's a bad idea because we're going to lose our queen. Because almost anybody will trade away a bishop to take a queen, or even a bishop and a knight to take a queen. That's part of why we're often going to castle here. Castling both gets our rook possibly into the fight and pulls the king further away from the center of the board, so we don't have to worry as much about attacks that will go after both the king and the rook with a knight, or that could potentially force us to choose between our king and our queen. Keeping those pieces a little bit further apart is usually a good idea. Now, if you're playing Black, this is a fantastic opportunity to go ahead and pin that knight. Because at this point, Black has pinned two of White's pieces. We have the relative pin, where it's a bad idea for White to move their knight that's sitting there on f3. And we have the absolute pin, where even if that knight was gone, it would be illegal to move the f2 pawn, because doing so would expose our king to that bishop sitting there on c5. Yet another reason why it's such a great idea to get out pawns and knights and bishops pretty early in your game. So how do we respond? Well, if you study what upper-level chess players do in this situation, there's a lot of paths they'll take. When you get to the upper levels of chess, or even the kind of like upper intermediate levels, a lot of it boils down to making moves that you are comfortable with, that your opponent is not comfortable with. And in this case, bringing our knight to d2 both gives us a defender other than the g2 pawn and queen on our knight that has been pinned. And it gives us the potential to get that d2 knight over to the center or over to the king's side, so that we're ready to launch future attacks. Since White is clearly trying to centralize or move their power over to the king's side, well, we're going to go ahead and have Black castle here. Remember that when you're castling, you usually want to castle somewhat early in the game, unless you're intentionally saving castling as your waiting move for later, a move that you make because you're wanting to see what your opponent does next. But just like white castling allows us to get the h1 rook into a position where it's helping to defend the queen and is defended by the queen and could potentially step over to the e-file to join the fight for the center, well, black has a lot of those same advantages. And one more that we haven't mentioned yet for white, although it does exist. Getting your king and your rook castled gives you an additional defender on that pawn that's pinned by your opponent's bishop. Now, white has that exact same defender, but we don't need to worry too much about that yet, because it's pretty rare to see a rapid attack from that bishop to smash apart your king's castle this quickly. But it's worth keeping in mind for later in the game. All right, so we have castled. But now we've got that troublesome bishop. That bishop's just keeping us from using our knight. So we're going to try to kick it by moving the pawn from h2 up to h3, right there at the edge of the board. We put pressure on the bishop. And sure, our opponent could decide that they're going to take the bishop, and then we take with our pawn, and then our king is sitting there exposed. But just like trading our bishop for a pawn that's going to result in losing the bishop to a rook early in the game, there are people who'll do it, especially if you're playing blitz chess, rapid chess. But if you're playing the long game, if you're playing the quiet or the very quiet game, then losing a bishop early on just to damage your opponent's castle is frequently not a winning strategy. That said, rather than retreating the bishop all the way back to its home square, or even to, say, e6 or d7, where it could be useful in the future, we're going to keep it on h5 for black. Because by staying in this diagonal between the bishop's position and the white queen, we're making sure that white has to keep worrying about that knight, and that white is not able to start building up pieces to, say, attack e3. So what are we going to do? Let's nudge our rook over to e1. The rook can't attack through our pawn, but it can defend the file. It can give us this pressure that makes it more likely that our opponent is not going to join in the fight. And this is where I have to admit I'm taking a little bit of a side path for black. There are a lot of options, including black moving their own rook to e8 to contest the e-file. But doing that, it's mirroring, it's pressuring, it's high-level play. It's definitely worth doing. But the exchange of pieces that's building up in the center, that knot, that pressure, all of the carnage that's going to result once trading begins, it's the sort of thing that a low to mid-level player might want to avoid. And that's why nudging that pawn up to a6, with the plan of in the future taking the b pawn up to b5 to pressure the bishop, well, that can be a solid plan. So let's retreat that bishop. Let's have white pull that bishop back to b3. As with the black bishop at h5, The b3 bishop still threatens all the way up there to the king. It maintains the pressure while protecting our piece. Of course, it's still a good idea to nudge that b5 pawn forward, because now, well, that bishop sitting there on b3, it's almost stuck. It has a little bit of a retreat square, but it can't step forward safely without risking being captured by a pawn or a knight. At this point, we have completed the opening phase of a game. We are solidly either at or approaching midgame. Midgame, that strange place in chess where it comes down to individual tactics and individual moments of decision of whether you value your knight or your bishop more, whether you want to try and pull your opponents over to the queen's side, whether you want to smash up through the center, or, and here's one thing that white has prepared for, whether you want to continue bringing your knight over to the king's side, clearing a path for your bishop to attack, and potentially being able to throw 2 bishops, 2 knights, and even a pawn or 2 at the H, G, or F file. This is the sort of planning ahead that can be difficult in chess. And I want to encourage you that if at any point all of this talk about what you expect your opponents to do versus what they actually do versus what they might do, don't worry if that starts to feel a little overwhelming. What we're trying to do as we start off playing chess and slowly work our way up to becoming more intermediate or even advanced players is we want to think about how our pieces work together. We want to try to either occupy or threaten the middle of the board. And we want to try and predict where our opponents will attack and then defend those squares using pawns, knights, or bishops, because our opponent is less likely to trade away their rooks and their queen, and even less likely to trade away a knight or a bishop than a pawn most of the time. And that's why we went with this example of black trying to maybe pull the pressure over to the queen's side, the A file, some more, while white is trying to shift power over to the king's side and do a more direct attack. And I hope you've noticed that sitting here at the end of turn 10, we haven't had a single capture yet. I'm not saying you shouldn't capture pieces before turn 10, but you're more likely to be successful if you spend those first 5 to 10 turns of a chess game maneuvering your own pieces into spots where they're protecting each other and where they're blocking your opponent from moving into your territory. Try it out. Think about building your pawns into chains. If you can't get a chain going, build them into a zigzag, and do your best to make sure that you have got a couple of bishops or a couple of knights, or preferably both, out and attacking across the middle of the board, but maybe staying on your own side instead of crossing into your opponent's territory, at least until you are ready to trade away pieces. Thank you so much for joining me today, folks. I'm Andrew Linke, and if you enjoyed this, or if you have some polite comments on other paths that would be likely to follow, or better ways to understand the opening phases of a game, please go ahead and comment down below if you are watching on YouTube. Those of you who are in my chess classes over on OutSchool, please remember to keep your comments in the classroom. And if you happen to have a good defense against the Italian game, which this is based on, or the very slow or very quiet game. If you have a way that black could smash into white's defenses and utterly destroy this for, say, a blitz or rapid technique, I'd absolutely love to hear about that in the comments. Because I think about chess often at the intermediate stages, thinking about it in, half an hour to 2 hours per game. But I know that a lot of you out there on the internet love playing rapid chess, which does tend to have a slightly more aggressive strategy, but often still does require you to think about your knights and your bishops a little bit more than your queen or your rook here in the early game. Take care, y'all.